Welcome to the Hammer Museum. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs and Education here. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Billy Wilder Theater. Tonight I'm very pleased to co-host another evening with the Zócalo Public Square Lecture Series. Please join me in welcoming Zócalo founder and director Gregory Rodriguez.
Thank you all for coming. We're really grateful to Claudia Bester, as always, and the Hammer Museum at UCLA. We'd like to thank some of the people who give us some cash, the California Endowment, the James Irvine Foundation, the Annenberg Foundation, the California Healthcare Foundation, and we also don't get cash, but we have a media sponsor in laobserve.com. We are happy to be here at the Hammer again, and we hope you come back to future programs. I'd like to bring out now tonight's panelists, and as I do so, I would like to introduce, as he's getting situated, tonight's moderator, Mr. David Kippen. David Kippen is the National Endowment for the Arts Director of Literature, National Reading Initiatives, and Program Director of The Big Read. Mr. Kippen has been a book critic and essayist for the San Francisco Chronicle and National Public Radio's Day to Day, and is film critic for XM Radio's Bob Edwards Show. He also has published The Schreiber Theory, a radical rewrite of American film history, and a new translation, and David Kippen is a very smart man, of Cervantes' The Dialogue of the Dogs. We're always very happy to welcome Mr. David Kippen to Zócalo. Thank you.
Thank you all, and thank you, Gregory, for coming tonight. We've got a really exciting and action-packed hour. As you can see, it's a large panel. But it would have to be a large panel and a much larger one than this to fit in all the people, all the Angelinos especially, to whom the archbard of this city, John Fante, means so much. I wish I could say that if he were alive today, there's no place he would rather be. But as some of you may know, the Dodgers are playing the Padres down the coast tonight, so maybe that isn't quite the case. Anyway, I'm thrilled to be here, and I want to introduce the panel before we go one step farther. To my immediate left is Frances Anderton. She creates the DNA, that is Design and Architecture program, on the third Tuesday of every month and 24 hours a day in cyberspace for KCRW. She's also the producer of Which Way LA and To the Point on KCRW with Warren Olney. And also a lover of John Fante, though at great pains to point out, by no means an expert, and she has that in common with myself. We are here as lovers of Fante. At the other end of the spectrum, no less a lover of Fante, but certainly an expert, is Stephen Cooper, Mr. Fante's biographer, in his wonderful book, Full of Life, which I see under some arms and on some armrests out there even tonight. He's also a professor of literature at Cal State Long Beach and an erstwhile winner of the National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship for Literature, with which I had nothing to do. To his left, we have Richard Shave, who is the proprietor of Esotouric, Bus Adventures into the Secret Heart of Los Angeles. I encourage anyone within the sound of my voice to Google same, that is E-S-O-T-O-U-R-I-C, Esoteric, with a tour in the middle. A true mainstay and patron of his native Los Angeles. By the way, we have a panel here composed exclusively of Los Angeles natives. I'm assuming some of those clapping might be able to make the same claim. And to Richard's left, we have Victoria Fante Cohen, the managing partner of the Fante Literary Trust, and to her left, her brother, Jim Fante, the silent partner of the Fante Literary Trust. And I have but one more introduction to make before we delve into our tribute to the absent man of honor tonight. And that is a woman named Jeanne Gerard, who is a manuscripts librarian at UCLA, who has a bit of news to make. I wonder if she might be prevailed upon to join us on stage for just a moment. Ladies and gentlemen, Jeanne Gerard from the absolutely tremendous Special Collections Library at UCLA. Jeanne, fill us in.
Hello. Is this working? Yes. Well, it is my honor to announce on behalf of the Charles E. Young Research Library, Department of Special Collections, that we have acquired the literary papers of John Fante. We're happy about it too.
The papers, Stephen may tell you a lot more about this, but the papers consist basically of original, heavily annotated manuscripts and drafts of books, short stories, and screenplays, a lot of personal correspondence, business records, periodicals with articles by and about John Fante, proofs of his books, several personal items, and Stephen Cooper's manuscript of his published biography. So researchers will soon be able to search the UCLA Library's catalog and our online finding aids and discover relationships between Fante and other writers whose papers are in our collections, such as Raymond Chandler, Jim Thompson, Jim Tully, Horace McCoy, Nathaniel West, and others. There are also the papers of others who shared common interests and concerns as Fante, immigration, racism, poverty, the underclass, ethnic identity, social injustice. So for instance, we have, UCLA has the largest extant collection of Carrie McWilliams, who was Fante's very close friend for 30 years. Performing Arts Special Collections has a collection of Irving Lerner, who I just discovered. That collection includes some of Fante's screenplays. So I'd like to thank the Fante family, Vicki and Mike, Jim and Jennifer, Dan, for partnering with former head of Special Collections, Victoria Steele, and Gary Strong, university librarian, on this wonderful acquisition. And although recognition for his writing may have been late in coming, John Fante's papers will now, and hereforward, foster scholarship about this great writer and the perspective and insight about Los Angeles that he revealed through his writings. So thank you.
Thank you. Jeanne Gerard. Well, before we go one step farther, I think it's high time we heard a little Fante. I think I'm going to arrogate to myself the moderator's prerogative of reading a little bit, and then I'm going to throw to Francis for perhaps the most justly famous paragraph that John Fante ever wrote. But this is from not the first, but in fact, a common mistake which I've occasionally been guilty of, not the first, but the third page of Ask the Dust. Then a great deal of time passed as I stood in front of a pipe shop and looked, and the whole world faded except that window, and I stood and smoked 'em all, and saw myself a great author with that natty Italian briar, and a cane, stepping out of a big black car, and she was there too, proud as hell of me, the lady in the silver fox fur. We registered, and then we had cocktails, and then we danced a while, and then we had another cocktail, and I recited some lines from Sanskrit. And the world was so wonderful because every 2 minutes some gorgeous one gazed at me, the great author, and nothing would do but I had to autograph her menu, and the Silver Fox girl was very jealous.
Los Angeles, give me some of you. Los Angeles, come to me the way I came to you, my feet over your streets, you pretty town, I loved you so much. You sad flower in the sand, you pretty town.
I wonder if we, thank you. I wonder if we could now turn to Stephen for just a bit and hear a little about where John Fante was in his life, both at the time that he was living this and then a few years on when he was writing it.
Sure. First, though, I have to say that this is a little bit like a dream to me, because when I first read Ask the Dust many, many years ago, I knew nobody who had ever heard of it or John Fante, and now to have so many of you show up tonight to help celebrate his 100th, the centenary of his birth really means a great deal.
Well, without you here, I dare say we wouldn't have half this crowd, so the thanks belong in part to you.
Thank you. He wrote the novel in a rush, late 1938, November perhaps he started, and by the beginning of May, he had shipped the manuscript off to his publisher. At that time, he was a man of 29 years old, living in Los Angeles. He had already worked in Hollywood studios for several years, published a novel, a fair number of short stories in the leading periodicals of the day. And so the time he was writing the novel, he had past the period in his life of struggling that the novel is about. It's a mistake, I think, that some people make, and they can be understood for making it, thinking that he wrote the novel while living the life that he's writing about. No. He was married at the time of writing the book and already quite a professional and professionalized writer. The time he was writing about, however, the early years of his arriving in Los Angeles from Colorado, bear striking similarities to the extremes of the novel. There were months and perhaps as much as a year in the earliest 30s when Fante was really living hand to mouth, going to the Grand Central Market and subsisting on oranges and just giving his all in order to write, much like Arturo does in the novel. So I like to bear in mind the discrepancy between the John Fante who wrote the book, the John Fante who lived the book in some respects, and how the two come together.
I wonder if we could ask, maybe Jim, is it reckless of us to assume that John Fante is Arturo Bandini? I mean, when you hear that voice, does that sound like your dad to you, or is it a sort of stylized version of your dad?
You know, I think it's one and the same person.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a little bit stylized, but he was every bit as fiery, as maybe more so than Arturo Bandini in person. Yeah.
Now, you are the youngest of John Fante's children, is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Was he quite as fiery by the time he got around to parenting you?
Well, he could be. I remember it was his 49th birthday. We're all sitting there at the table in the house in Malibu, and he announced that he was a diabetic. And it didn't, at the time, seem like it meant that much to me or to anybody. You know, we were concerned about it, but it changed his lifestyle. He almost never drank after that.
Really?
Didn't eat sweets, lost weight, didn't go out. So, no, he wasn't a wild man that I remember at all, or that my sister would remember.
Is that about right?
No.
I should say a little bit about how this should work. I would like this, if at all possible, to be a conversation without alarming the engineer unduly. So if anyone feels the need to jump in, by all means do, within the bounds of reason. I wonder, Francis, I just wanted, if you would share with us a little bit of your experience coming to Los Angeles and having Fante, or at least Ask the Dust, as a kind of unofficial introduction to the plays. Do you remember what that was like?
Yes, and just the fact that you've talked about me coming to LA underscores the fact that I'm not a native of LA. You said we were all natives.
Oh, I guess,
but,
yeah.
Yes.
But
I feel like one.
I think if you produce enough Which Way LA, we grandfather you in.
Thank you, and I've always said to anyone that knows me that LA is absolutely my spiritual home, so I feel like a native. And probably, I don't know, Fante with his marvelous metaphor of the desert under the city would see LA as being something, and Angelinos that sort of spring from nothing, you know. So so I probably, in his view, I might earn Angelino status. But no, I first came to LA in 1987 to edit a special issue on LA for an architecture magazine I was working for, and I really knew very little about LA. In fact, almost nothing except what I saw on TV, you know, the Hollywood imagery and freeways. And I was flying to LA, and I basically read 3 books, and one of them was Bret Easton Ellis. I'm not sure if he stands the test of time, but the other two, I think have stood the test of time, which is Raina Banham's Los Angeles, The Architecture of Four Ecologies, and Ask the Dust. And I can't remember why I picked Ask the Dust. That I don't remember, but I do remember that it had a profound effect on me, in as much as anyone that knows England, well, one knows there's a certain way of English writers, at least up until 50 years ago, sort of expressing themselves, which was, probably rather more sort of refined language, keeping stuff back, And then also, of course, I come from a very wet country, and there was something about this combination of the visceral quality of his writing, the visceral expression of these emotions, coupled with this depiction of this place that was arid and an aridity that I had not experienced in England. So that quality that he somehow captured, and this juxtaposition of the dark and the light, and the pretty and the sad, and the tortured and the Lady in the Silver Fox Fur, all of that I've always found fascinating about LA, and he articulated it. So, but this combination of this amazing inner life that he conjures, like you in the paragraph you read, he's in his interior universe, and then just nailing in this extremely palpable way the physical quality of LA. I guess all of those things made a deep impression on me.
We should bear in mind, I guess, that if John Fante were somehow to join us on stage today, he would not be any more entitled than yourself to call himself a native of Los Angeles. And I wonder if, Stephen, you might just talk for a bit about how he came to become an Angelino. It's always struck me oddly that so many of the people we think of as canonical Los Angeles writers, Fante, but also Carey McWilliams and Dalton Trumbo, another favorite of mine, are in fact from Colorado.
Yeah.
Was there some sort of?
What is the Colorado connection?
Yeah, that's my question for you,
Was
Stephen.
Carey McWilliams from Colorado?
He was indeed.
Yeah, yeah. Interesting juxtaposition, this friendship, Carey McWilliams and John Fante.
For those of you who don't know, Carey McWilliams, longtime editor of The Nation and author of Southern California, An Island on the Land, and North from Mexico, and other great nonfiction works about California.
McWilliams has been called the most important nonfiction writer on things California. Yeah. But John Fante was the son of a poor Italian-American family. His father was an immigrant from Italy. His mother was born in Chicago, but was thoroughly Italian-American. And the family was often really, really poor. Mm-hmm. Carey McWilliams comes from a very privileged background. His father was a state senator, I believe, or an elected legislator of some sort in Colorado, and a wealthy rancher. But they both made their way to Los Angeles when their respective families went bust. John Fante's father notoriously left the family for another woman, and John took it upon himself to hitchhike, ride the rails, make his way as well as he could from Boulder to Wilmington, of all places. He settled in Wilmington, where he had a couple of uncles, and went to work there at various menial, often really hard manual labor to support his mother and his one brother and a sister who all followed him out here. The fact that he is now regarded as the prototypical Los Angeles writer is something I think we want to pay attention to. But he became that in pretty short order. He spent 2 years perhaps in Wilmington and Long Beach before moving to Los Angeles. And within months, before a year had passed, he really lived at the sort of social, cultural center of Los Angeles, thanks to his friendship with Carey McWilliams, who was as well placed as a person could be. He was a practicing attorney and a writer and a political activist. Another friend, Ross Wills, was the story editor at MGM. So there are the movies. With McWilliams, it was politics. And Hanna, I'm blanking on his first name.
Bill?
No, yeah, Bill Townsend Hanna?
Yeah, I think so.
Yes, the editor of Touring Topics, which was to become Westways magazine. And Hannah's interests were all things California. And so in short order, Fante made himself over into, if not a native, then certainly as Californian as he could be, and Los Angelino as could be.
You know, if I may say so, Richard has a great piece by Ross Wills that he brought to read, and
Yes, and you gave it to me, and I was just looking for it.
wherever that is.
While you fish it out, let's set this up a little bit. Richard, I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about what Fante means to those of us who love Los Angeles, or perhaps with an assist at first from Ross Wells. Your call.
Well, let me just pick up on what Francis came out to Los Angeles in '87 with Banham in one hand and Fante in the other, and Rainer Banham and John Fante is really how I like to start too, because my wife and I started looking at downtown very seriously about 5 years ago, and we wanted to. Rainer Banham, in his book Los Angeles and Architecture for Ecologies, notoriously writes one paragraph about downtown Los Angeles. It's a footnote, because downtown doesn't exist. And Rainer, God bless him, whom I studied with at Santa Cruz, was wrong. And when I started to try and understand 5 or 6 years ago back what downtown was, I started with Fante. Arturo Bandini wandering through Bunker Hill and Pershing Square, which is this neighborhood that the city destroyed back in the 50s. And this whole world that existed doesn't exist anymore. We're trying to understand the history of downtown. Arturo Bandini and Rainer Banham sort of missing each other. Banham thinking that there's nothing downtown, and Arturo Bandini as the hero of lost Bunker Hill.
You and Francis, with Banham under one arm and Fante under the other. It's like the last scene of Inherit the Wind, where he's got a copy of The Origin of Species in one hand and the Bible in the other.
Exactly.
It's interesting, actually, because Rainer Banham's depiction of LA is different. They both love LA in such different ways. And Fante finds its dark heart as well as the ecstasy, I suppose. And Rainer Banham just takes a sheer unadulterated sort of love of pop culture joy in LA, doesn't he?
I wonder if any of you have any recollection, first or second hand, of John Fante's reaction to the obliteration of the Bunker Hill that we now know really only through his work. I mean, he was, I assume, privy to that whole urban
I just
renewal.
remember there was it was a radio interview, probably in the 70s, and they were asking him about that, and he had been back to downtown Los Angeles, and he just said, I don't recognize it. He'd lost his connection with it.
Was that your personal?
And I'd like to add that when we were children, our father took us to downtown LA to ride on the red car.
Oh.
Because he said, you need to ride the red car because it's going to be, they were ripping it out. So he wanted to make sure we had that experience.
Angel's Flight too, didn't you say?
He took me to Angel's Flight, yeah.
True.
And I didn't, I was so young I didn't even know of Ask the Dust.
No, neither of us did. We didn't.
We went up and down Angel's Flight, and he pointed to where he lived, and he took me to the Grand Central Market and bought some fruit. And,
You mean
years
he could
later, I
actually
read the
eat
book, I
oranges
go,
after living off nothing but for all those years?
Yeah.
Also, I sent you, Vicky, that article that he wrote in 1955. You'd already moved to Malibu, but in 1955, the Bunker Hill redevelopment plan had been published, and the CRA had started to begin to, through eminent domain, seize all 137 acres of Bunker Hill. And he wrote this really wonderful piece about the Bunker Hill he knew and the Bunker Hill that would be lost. So
that's right.
So early, I mean, 55 was pretty early to be hep to this, I think. So I think he was always.
When did they actually rip out Bunker Hill? Do you remember?
In 1959, they got the last clearances. The state Supreme Court gave them the okay, and they started ripping it out in 59. By 64, I think it was all raised.
So, Richard, if we wanted to go out tonight or tomorrow and, look for his haunts and
The King Edward Saloon tomorrow night.
by all means mention
The
this.
King Edward Saloon at 5th and Los Angeles Street is the last Skid Row bar. It's still there. It's page 75 of your edition, Francis. I believe Arturo takes his royalty check and squanders it on the B-girls at the King Edward. And so we're all going to go down there tomorrow night.
And everybody's invited?
Everyone's invited. There are a couple places left of John Fante's Bunker Hill.
Tell us.
There's a wonderful stone retaining wall on Olive Street at 4th. There's the Goodwill, where Arturo buys a suit in, I think it's Dreams from Bunker Hill. The Goodwill is still there at 2nd and Broadway. And of course, Grand Central Market is still there. Angel's Flight will reopen. They're
May
still,
it be soon.
Yes, will reopen.
What there aren't are these marvelous, these buildings that don't exist anymore that he describes so well. They're set on the hill in reverse. So you enter at the 10th floor is in the basement.
Yeah.
I love that.
And
idea.
is that historic? I mean, you can vouch
that's
for that.
for real.
Oh,
Yeah.
good Lord. Well, now, it's altogether too tempting and delicious to sort of fetishize, the man's life and haunts at the expense of the prose. I want to turn to Stephen for a couple of minutes here just to talk about how you would characterize the prose. I mean, what are the tells and the giveaways that you can always spot in a page of Fante? What makes his prose his and no one else's?
Yeah. The phrase I think that sums it up most simply is to say that it's deceptively simple. Fante's prose is as accessible as any American writing that I know of. You don't have to have a PhD to read it, much less to enjoy it. It's there and it comes across as directly as any American prose that I know. But try to parse his sentences, try to take them apart, and it becomes clear very quickly that there's a poetic vision at work that disregards sort of conventional rules of grammar and syntax in order to penetrate the surface of the narrative and evoke the interior states of his protagonist, Arturo Bandini. He learned this by studying very, very, very rigorously the works of all things, a Norwegian 19th century novelist, Knut Hamsun, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1920. There's a marvelous series of letters from his agent in 1936, Elizabeth Noel, writing to him from New York.
This is Fante's agent. Yeah.
Fante's agent, urging him to read and to study Hamsun's masterpiece, Hunger. Hunger was published in 1880-something, and it traces a young man in Christianstad, which is now Oslo, who wants only to write a great novel, who is starving to death because he doesn't have work, and who's obsessively following a beautiful woman through the city. This is a thread that if you read Ask the Desk carefully, you'll easily identify as part of the narrative of Ask the Dust. But the prose style owes as much to Hamsun's prose style as to any other writer. Sherwood Anderson was an influence as well. But he can go from just the coarsest and some might even be repulsed by some of the sort of direct ways that he comes at his subjects, from that to just vaulting, exalted, poetic flights. You've already read one, Francis has.
Yeah, and I'm tempted to do it again just because I want to. I mean, there's something so ragged and spontaneous about it. Los Angeles, give me some of you. Los Angeles, come to me the way I came to you. My feet over your streets, you pretty town. I loved you so much. You sad flower in the sand, you pretty town. I mean, there must have been somebody at, who's the publisher for this book?
The original publisher?
Yeah.
Stackpole Sons.
Stackpole Sons, who said, query Mr. Fante, don't you say you pretty town twice here? Well, he does, and it works, and I'm not sure why. Was he a notorious rewriter? You've seen these manuscripts that were just donated to UCLA. Did this burn out of him in one great outpouring, or did he go back and really worry it to death?
In fact, the one manuscript that I have not seen is the manuscript for Ask the Dust, which is a mystery. We know not where it is.
When was it last seen?
No one knows.
Nobody
That's
knows.
even in question.
That's a mystery.
It died with him and my mom. We don't know.
We don't know.
I've made great efforts to locate it, and if anybody can assist, we would all appreciate
Be
it.
grateful.
But to answer your question,
Yeah.
Ask the Dust by his account and by his wife Joyce's account poured out of him with little in the way of need for revision. Other stories, other novels, not so. And the manuscripts attest to the hard work he did writing and rewriting in order to get things right. But Ask the Dust, as he characterized it, was a boil that needed to be bled.
Well, that was that amazing year, too, end of 38, beginning of 39. I mean, if
Yes.
you'd driven down the streets of Los Angeles in the middle of the night, you'd have heard typewriters clacking at the Fante place where he was working on Ask the Dust, the Chandler House where he was writing The Big Sleep, and Nathaniel West's where he was working on Day of the Locust.
Yeah.
I mean, it boggles the imagination.
And were they friends, those three?
Fante met Nathaniel West. I don't know that he and
I
Chandler
think
ever.
they all, well, Chandler was at Stanley Rose's too.
They,
Great
all
bookstore
were, they
in
were all
Hollywood.
habitues
They would all meet
of
at
Stanley
Stanley
Rose
Rose
Bookshop. I'm not sure that they were ever there at the same time, but I'd like to think they were.
And John, weren't you saying that he was pressed into service sometimes when William Faulkner couldn't quite make his deadlines?
That's a nice way of putting it. Yeah. What he told me about that was that Faulkner, he was a name, but he drank all the time, and so Dad was a ghostwriter for Faulkner in Hollywood.
Ghosting his screenplays, not his fiction.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I don't know how often that occurred, but it happened. I mean, you probably would know how.
That I know less about than I know about their drinking together. There's a hellacious story that Albizarides tells of drinking with Fante and Faulkner and just staggering down Hollywood Boulevard singing dirty limericks. And,
Care to favor us with any, or?
the-
There is a reception in the
it's a-
courtyard afterward, if you're so inclined.
Read my biography. I can't quote that passage by memory, but it's in there.
And then after Ask the Dust, as his career began, at least from a publishing standpoint, a fiction standpoint, to fall into a kind of eclipse, what was going on then? What characterized those years?
Ask the Dust came out in '39, and Dago Red, a collection of short stories, came out in '40, and he was poised to become the next John Steinbeck. That's what Viking, his then publisher, had designs on for him. It never happened for some pretty interesting reasons. The publisher of Ask the Dust, which was not Viking but Stackpole, was sued by the representatives of Adolf Hitler, of all people, for having published an unauthorized version of Mein Kampf.
Was this the one translated by Alan Cranston, or did I hallucinate that?
I never heard that, David. I don't know.
Not admiringly by any means, but there is such a story. Anyway, go on.
But Hitler's people won this lawsuit, and
Isn't that a
Stackpole
crazy
almost
story?
went out of business, and what might have gone into publicity and advertising for that year's authors, including John Fante, kind of was drained away. The war started, the Second World War. Everybody was a little bit distracted for good reason, and Fante went to work for the Office of War Information up in San Francisco, and then entered a 10-year period of writing pretty bad movies, pretty bad scripts that never even were made into movies, golfing an awful lot and drinking perhaps a bit too much, and didn't write much for a good 10 years. And so his star sort of failed to really launch. And thereafter he had some good luck. In fact, the next novel he published, Full of Life, was a bestseller. It was serialized in, I forget which slick, Reader's Digest, was it? I'm not sure.
Yeah.
And was made into a popular movie. His Hollywood career continued, and there were good years and years that perhaps weren't so good. But it's true that his publishing life went into an eclipse through the 50s and the 60s.
Jim, I remember you told me once when your dad your dad called you all into a room. I think there's a pool table there, and he made the announcement about having to write a television scenario.
Yeah. There was Gene Kelly, who was a famous movie star in the 50s. He had a TV series called Going My Way, and Dad hadn't made a nickel in I don't know how long. And writing television in those days it was just not a good thing. I mean, he felt very demeaned about the whole thing. So he got us all together and just announced that he was doing a Going My Way, and he had tears running down his face. And
I remember this well.
we felt bad. We felt bad, but it was $10,000.
Yeah.
So he said it's $10,000, and we need the money. So.
But Richard, you were making an interesting point earlier to the effect that his final book, bore the earmarks of someone who'd put in all those labors as a screenwriter and not necessarily for the worse.
Oh, right. I often say that I think Dreams from Bunker Hill, which he dictated to your mom, yeah, just before he died. That's very much. There's a narrative structure there. This is written by a guy that's been writing 3-act screenplays for falling out of bed and writing them.
Yeah.
Just it's very different than his first Bunker Hill novel, Last of the Dust. Real pace.
Very unedited as well. I mean, he dictated that to my mom. He was blind and dictated it, and she just copied down on a yellow stencil pad, and then it was over. That was it.
As someone fascinated like I am with writing's therapeutic properties for the writer himself, I mean, I wonder if you could say a little bit about the state he was in before.
Oh, he had advanced diabetes, and eventually he lost his sight and both his legs. And somewhere in the middle of that debacle, he lost his mind. So he was still living at home, and you could go see him and stuff, but he really didn't know what was going on. And he hadn't written in, I don't know, 2-3 years at least. And then one day my mom calls me and she said, "You won't believe what's happening. He's writing a book." I said, "How can he write a book? He doesn't even know who he is." "Oh, you'll see." So I go out there, and we had a patio in the back, and he was sitting where he liked to sit.
This is the Malibu house.
At the Malibu house. Yeah. He'd sit out there and listen to Dodger games and stuff on the radio because he couldn't see. But he was dictating this book, and he was alert. He was sitting up straight, and my mom's like,
happy.
"Can you believe it?" I said, "Yeah, I believe it." And it didn't take very long. I don't remember exactly, but it was got to be the quickest book he wrote. Maybe 2 months, and there was this stack of these yellow things, and she sent it off, and there you go.
To appreciate, the feat, close your eyes and try to write a paragraph.
Yeah.
And then multiply that by several hundred, keeping a whole novel in your mind. It's amazing.
200 pages, and it all flowed, and
Well, maybe the next best thing before we open it up to questions would be to close our eyes and listen to some of Fante's prose read by Victoria, who has just a couple of pages with her I think she wanted to impart.
I do. Tonight, I'm going to read from West of Rome, which is a combination of 2 short stories, one of which is My Dog Stupid. And I'm going to read part of a chapter about Henry Melise talking about his daughter Tina. 3 weeks later, Rick Culp and Tina went over the hill. It came as no surprise. For days, Culp's bus had been parked in the driveway while they made preparations for the break. Tina bought yardage for flower print curtains and matching seat covers, sewing the material together while Rick pulled the engine and overhauled it. He also wired the bus with twin speakers for the cassette player. The surfboards were wrapped to the top of the cab. Some of the zing and romance went out of the trip when they realized that we made no protests about their going off together. It really was the only way to handle it, for they were determined, and there was no way we could have prevented them. For their sleeping together, they had done it for months, so why quit now? We assumed they would one day marry, but that wasn't mentioned either, lest Rick flee parental pressure. The only intrusion upon their privacy was an extra supply of pills Harriet slipped into Tina's suitcase. We gathered in the driveway for farewell, and Harriet wept. But I had no trouble staying calm and dry-eyed. From the beginning, I was never part of my daughter's world. She had always been ferocious to the point of instability, and there was only one workable strategy: to let her have her own way in all things. Observing her now, in white Levi's and a red blouse, her hair in 2 braids, her beautiful face angelically contravening the disposition of a wildcat, I thought how sad it was that we were strangers. She did not dislike me, she loved me, but thought I was a nuisance. Take good care of her, I said, shaking hands with Rick. You take good care of your dog. Stupid rested on the concrete, staring heavy-lidded and adoringly at Culp. Rick went over to him and poked him gently with the toe of his moccasin, saying, "Goodbye, stupid." The dog got to his feet, crossed to the rear wheel of the bus, raised his leg, and diddled on the hubcap, his way of exercising the territorial imperative. I kissed Tina. When will we see you again? Who knows, she sighed. Someday. Where are you going? North. Big Sur. Maybe. We knew nothing of Rick's finances, but Tina had withdrawn the $600 she had in a savings account, so there was no concern over the basics of food and lodging, at least not for a while. I figured they'd float around until the money was gone, and then they'd come back to Point Doom. Mother and daughter wept at the final embrace. Blinking away tears, Tina said, "You be nice to her, Dad. You hear me? I'll do my best." "I mean it," she said sternly. They stopped aboard. They stepped aboard, and I had a last look inside of the curiously stark tube. Despite curtains and color and a new carpet, it had a Mickey Mouse artificiality and lacked warmth and comfort. I gave them 2 weeks. With waves and thrown kisses, they scooted away toward the highway. My thought was, 1 down and 3 to go. But it seemed premature. In my heart, though, I hoped they were gone for good, for I wanted Tina's bedroom as my study. It had the best view of the ocean, with 2 large windows facing south, the finest room in the house. It also had built-in bookcases and an adjoining bathroom with a tub. But I was dreaming. They were back in a week. A one-night stopover to do their laundry and wash the bus. Tina raided the kitchen for pots, pans, seasoning, dish towels, a garbage can, a broom and a dustpan, a clock, a steam iron, and an ironing board. 3 days later, they were back again. This time to wash Tina's hair and use the hairdryer. They made off with a carton of cigarettes, a jug of wine, and a gallon of olive oil. Thereafter, that was the pattern. They never moved farther south than San Ysidro, and every night there was a collect telephone call to Harriet. Between the telephone and raids on the cupboard, she was more expensive than had she remained at home. I told her, too. Fish or cut bait? Are you living here or not? Of course I'm not. I'm just visiting. Fine. I'm moving into your room. Don't you dare. She marched out to the bus with an armload of blankets. Later, I discovered that she had locked the bedroom door with a key which couldn't be found.
Victoria
you.
Fante reading
Thank you.
from autobiographical work of her father at the opposite end of his career from Ask the Dust. And now, belatedly, though selfishly I could carry on like this all evening, I'd like to hear some questions from the audience.
Thank you. This on? We will now begin our Q&A portion of our wonderful discussion tonight. We want to remind you that our event tonight is being recorded for both video and audio podcasts, so all questions must be asked into the microphone. Just raise your hand and wait for a Zócalo staff to get to you. We will hold the microphone for you, and there's 2 of us going around. And lastly, if you can just state your name before your question, that would be great. Go ahead, Roberto.
I have a question to your left. Hi, David.
Hey, Leland.
I've walked David's dog down a dusty road to the beach in Malibu many times, invariably recalling the opening parts of My Dog Stoop. And I was wondering, for the Fantes, that seemed to be written contemporaneous with his family life out in Point Dume. I wonder if you guys remember the events of that book as real or as actual.
I think we both do.
They're wild extrapolations, but based on reality to some extent. There's the 4 children, and it's unmistakable who each one is. I mean, she's Tina. You know
Well,
that.
curiously, after that book was written, my father and mother called me into the patio, I guess out on the patio, and asked me or explained to me about the character Tina, and explained to me that that I should not misunderstand, that I was not Tina and this was a fictional character. I'm sure I stomped out of the room.
Before we take the next question, I just want to invite all of you to join us at our reception. All our panelists will be there to chat further with you on tonight's discussion. So join us out in the courtyard.
And we have another question, midsection on the left.
It's actually not a question. I just want to make some statements. My husband was one of the first developers to build a high-rise in downtown Los Angeles called One Wilshire. My name is Marlene Creedman. And he also bought...
Talk to me afterwards. Your husband owned the Alexandria.
Exactly
God
what I was
bless
going to
you.
say
Come
now.
find me. Okay.
And he bought the Alexandria in the 70s, early 70s, and it was quite successful. He refurbished it. And during the Second War, the ceiling was all blacked out. And when he was refurbishing the hotel, they were scraping off the ceiling, and they thought that it was a Tiffany ceiling, whether it was or not, but it looked like a Tiffany ceiling. And now it's sort of a flop house. Sad.
Well, it'll get another another turn at bat if LA history teaches us anything. Another question.
I'll take the next question right here to your right, or your left, rather.
Hi, thank you so much. That was so great. Julia. I was really fascinated by what you were saying. If you had driven through downtown, 38 to 39, how you would have heard those 3 typewriters kind of cranking out 3 incredible novels. And there have been really singular, great Angelino books since then, but there's never been that kind of cluster of 3 books that would be so singular in defining our city. I don't think any year since then. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Movies, too, in 1939.
So what about that time period was so ripe for kind of something that would become emblematic of the city? And why haven't those conditions kind of come together again?
I wish I could say if you go through William Mulholland's diaries, you can find mention of some additive to the water, but I have no clue. Just, may 1939 come back again soon and stick around a while. Any other hypotheses on the panel?
I can't answer the question, but I think that I've asked that question myself many times, and I think the answer would be to start anyway by reading the newspaper, going to the library and reading every day's edition of the Los Angeles Times and then Los Angeles Examiner, and there may have been other papers too back then, and immerse yourself in the time itself to see if you could discover what was going on, because it really was remarkable. And it seems to me there's a book in that. Simply,
There you go. Your next book.
What
that's a great question.
Where did she go? Where did Julia go?
She's here.
Julia, get yourself to Alvera Street. Go stand in front of the Plaza Church where Arturo Bandini got propositioned.
I've been many times. But what do I
Walk up Main Street. Get to Fifth Street. Go left. Walk past the King Edward at Los Angeles. Keep walking down Fifth Street to Central. Walk back to the Plaza. You've just created a triangle that during the Depression, that area, everyone, all these transient men came to. Raymond Chandler was down there. John Fante was down there. Jim Cain was down there. The American Logos was really in that neighborhood, that triangle. I really feel that something very special happened because of the train stations, the transient labor, the slew of SROs, that there was just this, it was just bubbling over.
Did they know it at the time, or is it only apparent in retrospect?
I think Cain knew that Fifth in Los Angeles was a special place. I think he
Well, I
did.
think my father did too.
Well, he never left. I mean,
He
had
never left.
Audrey, he would visit. I mean, he would go down to Main Street through the
He
60s and
did.
stuff. Yeah.
He talked, I mean, when he would make reference to Los Angeles, he would always, when we would ask him questions, he would make reference to specific sites and his love for it. So he was obviously drawn to it.
Another question?
Yes, we have a question here in the back to your left.
My name is Edward, and my question is it's probably not one that anyone on the panel will be able to answer, but I feel like it's a connection that is worth bringing up. And I'm not sure if any of you have read any of the novels of Roberto Bolaño, but his novel, The Savage Detectives, which came out a few years ago, I just recently read, and the protagonist of that novel, which is, it's assumed that the protagonist is a substitute for Roberto Bolaño. The protagonist is named Arturo Bolaño. And the whole time I'm reading that, I couldn't help but make the connection with Bandini. And I was wondering if anyone had any insight to maybe Roberto Bolaño's fandom of Fante, if that was a connection that he consciously made, or if maybe that's just coincidence.
I don't know.
I've been saying for years now that if one more person tells me to read Roberto Bolaño, I'm absolutely going to have to, and you're the person. So
He's fantastic. I recommend him to everyone in this room. If you love Fante, I think you'll also love Roberto Bolaño.
no higher praise. Thanks for the tip.
Okay, we have another question here to your left.
Yeah, hi, I'm Charles Bukowski, and I feel left out. Especially with what he wrote, and I always found what really excited me about Fante when I picked up the book was God, this feels weird. I'm used to holding my own microphone. I feel threatened. Sorry. I'm Josh, by the way. Can I hold it? Jesus Christ. Sorry, I just keep falling backward. But seriously, 2 points. In the introduction to Ask the Dust, he talks about being in the Central Library and finding a lifeline, if you will, and finding this vitality and the immediacy in the prose. And he contrasts it with all the, what he would call bullshit. So my question to that point is, what did Fante think of, how do you see his place among his contemporaries? And the second thing, just for fun, can any of you enlighten us as to where the genesis of the title "Ask the Dust," from where it comes?
I bet Stephen's going to run the table on those.
Yeah.
I know the answer.
Oh. This is a test, huh? Where Fante would place himself among his contemporaries, he thought he was the best.
He did.
He often
knew it.
came out and said he was the best. And that comes out, I think, in certain sections of Ask the Dust and The Road to Los Angeles, when Arturo is sort of crowing about how great he is. I think Jim or Vicky may be able to help here. I think he must have known what it felt like, though, too, to feel like not the best.
Oh, God, yeah.
Jim has a story about well, we were both in the garage one day when Dad received a rejection.
Well,
in
you could-
1933.
He'd written a novel called 1933 Was a Bad Year, which some of you may have read. He had written it after a long period where he hadn't written a book. I think the previous book was Full of Life, so it was like a 12-year gap there. And so he wrote the book and sent it off to his Full of Life publisher, and they sent a rejection letter back, said, "You've lost it," you know. And he was devastated.
Jim and I were in the garage with him, and he opened the letter and he was reading it, and he was physically, I mean, visibly crushed.
Yeah, I mean, you know, he thought he was a great writer, but he had doubts.
Oh,
he was
human.
very conflicted, you know. And if you told him he was a great writer, he'd love to hear it, but he had doubts too.
The title Ask the Dust comes from Knut Hamsun's novel Pan. It's a passage. The novel is about a young man, again in Norway in the late 19th century, who leaves society behind and goes to live on an island with his dog. And he's in love, but love is unrequited. And halfway or so through the novel, he remembers a fable from, as he puts it, 4 generations ago. The fable is about a lord who loved a lady and then saw someone else, and this someone else, this other woman, he gave himself to like a slave. And then the prose, the narrative sort of launches into this, I think of as Fante-esque, but it's actually Hamsun's stuff. Why would anybody love so this way? And the narrator's voice says, "Ask the dust on the road," as if there's no answer to the question.
Steve, I thought that was from Hunger, though.
That's from Pan.
It is from Pan?
Yeah.
Okay.
Am I
we
right?
have
Will we ever? Another couple questions? If there's
we
time?
have one more question in the back on your left.
Yeah, David Bergenrode. I have terrible with names. The man on the left mentioned the best paragraph, but did you read it? And if you didn't, please do. And Francis, you talked about discrepancy, but I thought he was just writing about himself as a younger man, which is done all the time, I think.
Oh, I don't think I talked about a discrepancy. No, more just...
No. The man, Francis said so. Francis used the word discrepancy.
But no, I'm Francis. This is...
I'm sorry, the man. My mistake.
Steve.
Steve, I'm sorry.
The discrepancy between, I'm sorry.
You said there was a discrepancy between the fact that at the time that he wrote, he was a married man, and he was writing about, I assume, Arturo Bandini, but wasn't he just writing about a younger self?
Well, yeah, but fiction has about it a way of altering and changing, you know, the way things actually were. So,
Sure,
Yeah.
I got you. I don't think it's discrepancy, that's all.
okay, fair enough.
All right, folks, we got a question here to your right.
First of all, this is a really great event. Thank you for doing this. This is wonderful.
Thanks for coming.
And I have every book that John wrote. In fact, this is so great because I just finished reading everything within the last year. So, but I have not read the biography, and I'm going to now because Dan says I have to. And this question is probably answered in the biography. But I want to frame it with the irony that here we are, within a few days of this, centennial of John's birth, and this incredible earthquake hits his very, the country and the
Not
region.
just Italy, but Abruzzi.
Exactly, the epicenter is Abruzzi. So,
50 miles from Torricelli, Poligna.
and I hope that your relations, which I'm sure you have there, are okay. But I want to ask you, and I forget which book this is, help me with this, but he does this amazing description of the Long Beach earthquake.
Let's Ask the Dust.
Is it an Ask the Dust?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Because I love that passage. Was he in the Long Beach earthquake?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Yes, he was. Yeah. Curiously,
I'm
the
Robert.
Long Beach earthquake was a 6.3. The earthquake in Italy the day before yesterday or so was 6.3. But he was there. Accounts differ as to what he did. The novel makes Arturo out to be terrified, so terrified that he makes up these giant lies about how heroic he was at the time. There are 2 published very short articles about Fante during the earthquake. One has him plunging 2 stories and landing unconscious and losing, I think, the manuscript of the book he was supposed to be writing at the time in the fire. The other article has him plunging 60 feet through the debris and emerging unscathed. Both of these, I have to think, were sort of products of his own self-promotion. Go ahead.
Also, if you go to Pershing Square, there's a fissure that runs out of the sometimes empty fountain at the southwest corner of the park. And it's an homage to Chapter 13 in Ask the Dust, which is the Long
I
Beach
spoke to the architect
earthquake.
who designed it.
Yeah.
And she said, absolutely, that came from Ask the Dust. And it represents the earthquake in Long Beach.
And of course, after the earthquake in Chapter 13, he goes and sleeps in Pershing Square because he's afraid to go back. Everyone's afraid to go back into the houses.
Sure.
Okay, we have another question to your left.
Hi, my name is Brian. I just had a real quick question. Well, I'll just say that I too read Ask the Dust on my way to Los Angeles. I was driving in an old 1970 Plymouth Valiant that was breaking down along the 5 from Seattle. And then I was reading Full of Life when my wife was pregnant with my my only set of twins. And at the same time that we were remodeling our house. Well, luckily I didn't fall through the floor. But my question is a very, very a simple question. I was working with an actor who was saying that he had these meetings with your father, and we were talking about that, and I was enamored of that he had met him, and we had this argument with each other because he said that your dad said that he wanted to be known as John Fante.
Well, they anglicized Fante, growing up in Colorado, and there was the Ku Klux Klan and all that stuff. I mean, seriously, they decided to call themselves the Fantes. And to this day, his brother, Tom, who's still alive, he's Tom Fante. He won't say Fante. So, Dad...
And we correct each other all the time.
My father was John Fante. That's who he said he was.
We have a question at the very top here to your right.
My name is Jesus. It's not quite a question, but I was picking up on another comment that was made from Julia, I think, about why is there a splurge of such great books. I'm not going to presume that I'm an expert on this, but I studied quite a bit of history of Los Angeles. And during the 1930s up to the 40s, there was a splurge of what is a Californio, what would define who is Angelino. And during this period, Latinos, not quite, but the Anglo communities, higher class, were using the idea of what is a California for Mexicans to develop Overo Street, the community of Los Angeles. And they really use the culture in order to develop. So I'm not sure if Fante and his friends and other authors were connecting with Overo Street and that triangle that you described through Fish Street and all the way back. But that was a center of culture and what determined who was a Californian and who was not a Californian. And if you did not fit in that triangle, you you were not a true Californian?
Well, if that's the secret, by all means, let's all go out and ask each other what it means to be an Angelino right now. If we're going to get 3 books like that out of it, it's well worth it. Thank you. Another question.
Okay, we have a question here to your left on the midsection.
Yes, my name is David, and I have a question that may just be a compliment. In the early 80s, I was interviewing a lot of crime writers in Southern California, and one of them, W.R. Burnett, was very respectful of John Fante. And I was curious if anyone on the panel knows if they had a acquaintanceship or a friendship, and to generalize that, how much John Fante considered himself a film writer, and if he related to that occupational description.
Burnett was a member of the stable of contract screenwriters at Warner Brothers at one time anyway, when John Fante was too. I don't recall any evidence of close friendship or even a collaboration, but they worked at the same studio at the same time at any rate. And was there a second part? I forgot.
Did he consider himself a
screenwriter? Oh, by all means. He was altogether professional, which is not to say he liked it. I think it's fair to say that he often hated the work of writing for the movies about as much as he loved writing.
He would never go to a premiere.
Really?
He would never go to a finished movie.
He talked about the machine in his head, the camera machinery in his head that he had to sort of put up with when writing screenplays, which is to say, I think, that it wasn't a comfortable, fit for him.
He had his own idea. I remember going to films with him, unfortunately for us, a few times, and if he didn't like a movie, it didn't matter. He was just going to get up and leave. And I don't think I ever saw a film in a theater all the way through with him.
He was terrible. He'd do the same thing if he went to a restaurant and the service was bad. He'd say, "We're out of here."
And yet there's no record of anybody ever reading half of Ask the Dust.
I have a question in the very front row here.
Hi, my name is Jeff, and wherever Fante was, he really brought the city to life. And I pretty well know Los Angeles, but then you read Wait Until Spring, Bandini. And now I want to go explore Colorado. But my question is for Vicki and Jim. He was did he ever lose a fight? He was a very good fighter, wasn't he, with his cuffs?
And he
was he was very well proportioned.
5'2",
5'2".
5'3".
Okay.
He was barrel-chested, and you wouldn't want to mess with him.
what
Trust
I
me.
heard.
He used to fight prize fights for his father in Colorado. He was the quarterback of his high school football team.
Also a great baseball player.
Yeah.
He's quite an athlete.
Yeah, he's a tough guy, no doubt about it. I mean, you never thought of him as 5'2". Never. Never.
Think he's that tall?
He was to us.
And we have another question to your left on the midsection over here.
Hi, I'm Catherine, and I've been trying to feel the words for what I'm trying to ask or say, but I think it goes back to the idea of your father having felt conflicted about who he was to others. You know, at one point he felt great, and other times obviously was hurt. And I think that that concept of conflict and discrepancy, which we've been addressing in different areas here, feels to me also what's so beautiful about his work, because he doesn't need to have it be a singular note. I mean, it's so much about being real that of course there's discrepancy and conflict. And what I wanted to ask more about is how you feel that was addressed in his work in terms of spirituality, because to me I always felt the greatest wonder in his work is the innocence of faith and how that helps his characters while he's also railing against the the bullshit of early Catholic oppression and so on. So I kind of wanted to ask how you feel the conflict with innocence and faith versus what he was born into comes through in his work.
I'll take that one on. In Ask the Dust, Arturo runs the gamut from shaking his fist at God and complaining that although he, Arturo, is an atheist, how dare God mess around with him. Two, he asks God, have you read Nietzsche? Two, just this swooningly, breathtakingly beautiful passage just before the earthquake. He's just lost his virginity to Vera Rivkin at the apartment in Long Beach, and he's outside on the boardwalk of the Pike. And for a page and a half, he's thinking about the sea of faith that he's lost touch with, but that he feels certain he'll find his way back to. And I don't even want to dare summarize it because it can't be done. It's the next best thing to pure poetry. So he was aware of and embraced those contradictions. I'm always of a mind to think of Fante as not an either-or kind of a guy, but a both-and kind of a guy. He could negotiate paradox.
I have a cute story to tell that Richard wants me to talk about. This is true. I must have been in the 3rd grade, and I was at Catholic school. And do you remember this, Jim? We had to write stories about where our family was from, and many of the children were related to, I remember one child was related to Mary, Queen of Scots, and somebody was, they were all related to all these famous people. And I came home.
They all wind up in Malibu eventually.
And I came home and I said to my parents, well, I need to write about somebody, who were we related to? And Dad said,
Uncle Mingo and the Bandits?
And Dad said, Uncle Mingo and the Bandits. And I said, well, who's that? He said he was a horse thief. And I said, I can't write that. He said, yes, you can. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I do.
I have a question to your right. This will be our final question of the night. We do invite you to join us at the reception taking place out in the courtyard where you can chat further with tonight's panelists on tonight's discussion. Thank you.
Okay, I have a 2-part question. My name is Josh. I guess I live in Long Beach. You teach in Long Beach, Dr. Cooper. And I've just been reading and trying to find little snippets and traces of Long Beach in the fiction of John Fante. And Wrath of God, the story from Dago Red, was a story that he was that was going to be cut by the editor that picked up that book. And Fante was adamant of it staying in. He even, I think, changed the name of the female counterpart in that story to match the same name as the Helen, I think, in
Helen, thy beauty is to me.
No, that's a later story. This is his most famous story, Home Sweet Home. But I guess I just wanted to see if you, Stephen, could speak to that sort of like seed, that Wrath of God, that was planted in Wrath of God, that sprouted into the sort of Vera Rifkin Long Beach earthquake thing in Acid Dust, as well as this is totally unconnected. But
Okay.
It's more connected to his sort of pugilistic comment about Fante. There's that famous anecdote of Fante writing the note to Sinclair Lewis. I think it's at the Musso Franks or something.
Jason's.
And yeah, and he just completely insults him. And then when Sinclair Lewis stands up, he goes after Fante. And by that time, Fante's ran out the door and he's hiding in the car. And he's basically calls Fante out. And I was just wondering, I've read about that, I think, in your biography as well as in another source. So.
Boy, those are two big and different questions. Yeah, I believe that happened. He saw Sinclair Lewis at Chasen's. At least he claimed that was based in fact, and presumed to think that Sinclair Lewis, famous Sinclair Lewis, Nobel laureate Sinclair Lewis, would be happy to shake the hand of an adoring fan. And Sinclair Lewis was much more interested in being with, I think, the two women he was with. And Fante took it, the wrong way and really insulted him. And
nothing new about that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a better note to end on than the wrath of God.
Well, before we close, it's one thing to notice that Fante's 100th birthday is coming up and we ought to do something about it. But sorry?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow. But to actually go through with it and see all these wonderful people in the audience, I feel so grateful to have spent such an enchanted evening with you. And if you'll just join me in one last round of applause before we go out and raise a glass to John Fante for our panel.
And also, we want to encourage you to check our website, zocalopublicsquare.org. Tonight's event will be up tomorrow, both on video and audio, and there'll be a cool write-up on it with pictures. Maybe you'll catch yourself on it. So make sure you check it out. And thank you for coming. We'll see you in the courtyard. Thank you.